where we explore substantive issues by examining contrasting perspectives. Today, we're going to delve into interpretive disobedience. It's this idea of a citizen-led approach to constitutional engagement, especially, relevant now in an era where governmental action and, frankly, narrative shaping are increasingly seen as forms of engineering reality.
Right, and that brings us to a really critical question. Is this kind of resistance, this disobedience, is it a necessary safeguard for liberty, a way for citizens to sort of reclaim their agency? Or is it potentially destabilizing? Could it risk mirroring the very tactics it's trying to combat?
Exactly. And that's the tension we'll explore. I'll be arguing that interpretive disobedience, through various forms of resistance, maybe even sabotage, is actually a crucial mechanism for citizens to hold power accountable.
And I'll be raising some cautionary notes, suggesting that these methods, if we're not careful, could potentially undermine public trust and maybe even the foundations of a stable constitutional order.
Okay, so let's get into it. In our current environment, where we see these explicit plans like Project 2025, which lays out a really methodical approach to, quote, dismantle the administrative state and consolidate all that power directly in the presidency to roll out a very specific social vision, well, the traditional checks and balances can feel, frankly, woefully inadequate.
And Project 2025, just for clarity, is this very detailed blueprint from conservative groups planning for a potential future Republican administration. It's quite radical in its aims for restructuring government.
Precisely. And this ties into concerns about hyperstition. This idea that, fictional concepts can actually become real through belief and action, being used to, quote, engineer a very specific version of reality using narrative force. We're potentially facing a situation where the entire executive branch may be leveraging incredibly powerful tools like Palantir, Anduril, these advanced data and defense tech platforms might focus its immense resources on citizens seen as, insubordinate.
A concerning prospect, certainly.
Yeah. And our source material points out that the U.S. constitutional system wasn't actually designed for maximum efficiency. It deliberately incorporated inefficiencies, separation of powers, federalism, specifically to safeguard liberty. Interpretive disobedience, as it's described, is, I think, a vital return to that founding principle. It's the act of citizens directly reading the Constitution, engaging with it, and crucially, rejecting interpretations that seem to contradict plain meaning. Now, this can manifest as what's called bureaucratic warfare. It's where citizens sort of flip the script, using the bureaucracy's own rules against it. Think about introducing a multiplicity of minor errors in forms, or weaponizing the waiting room, maybe feigning profound confusion when faced with jargon, or even over-compliance, drowning them in paperwork. These aren't just petty annoyances. They create a steady, persistent drag on their operations. They generate a significant cumulative effect and help people reclaim agency in a system that often feels designed to make you powerless. It's a form of democratic action, really. Like those historical examples, Lakeville's townspeople nullifying federal laws. It doesn't require permission, just a willingness to take founding documents seriously.
Okay, I absolutely agree with your premise that the potential for state overreach, especially with initiatives like Project 2025, is deeply concerning, no question. However, I do worry that these methods you're describing, interpretive disobedience, bureaucratic warfare, while they seem empowering on the surface, might inadvertently lead us into a kind of fractured hall of mirrors. They could further erode public trust, which is already quite fragile. The stated goal of Project 2025, to engineer a very specific version of reality, is alarming, yes. But our sources also detail how things like hyperstition and weaponized language work. They function as a reality-generating engine by exploiting vulnerabilities, tapping into, deeper, often unconscious desires. So even resistance that starts with good intentions, if it starts employing similar tactics, subtly altering information, engaging in its own form of social engineering, doesn't it risk becoming part of the very problem it aims to solve?
That's a fair question.
And the source text on dark triad resistance explicitly warns about this. It says, quote, using dark triad methods to prevent one form of tyranny might inevitably lead to another. It risks perpetuating a cycle of distrust where it becomes frankly impossible for citizens to figure out what's true. And just to clarify, when we say dark triad methods, we're talking about manipulation, narcissism, a lack of empathy, putting self-interest first, disregarding truth, that cluster of traits.
Right.
Furthermore, Norbert Wiener's distinction between know what and know how feels really crucial here. Wiener talked about know what as understanding the purpose, the ethical goal behind an action, versus know how, which is just having the technical skill to do something. Now, if the resistance's know what, its guiding principles, isn't genuinely enlightened, then its know how, its ability to deploy sophisticated psychological, perhaps cybernetic tools, could lead us down a very dark path, a path where, as Wiener feared, the possibility for man to live and can grow to be a human being in the fullest and richest sense of the word is denied, replaced by a kind of fundamental reprogramming. So while the Constitution might have intended inefficiencies, widespread, uncoordinated sabotage could just lead to policy gridlock and administrative chaos, undermining institutional quality, stability, the rule of law. It might create more instability, not clarity, for everyone.
You raise a valid concern there about the potential for gridlock and eroding trust. And I appreciate you bringing in Wiener's distinction between know what and know how. But my point is that the current trajectory, the one we seem to be on, already poses, I think, a greater risk. A risk of a complete overhaul of our constitutional system, the imposition of a predetermined reality. Look at the simple sabotage field manual, originally from WWI, right? It explicitly targeted innumerable, simple acts which the ordinary individual citizen saboteur can perform with, and this is key, minimum danger of injury, detection, and reprisal.
Okay.
Modernizing these tactics for what's called bureaucratic warfare or digital dystopia recognizes that the enemy, whether that's an overreaching state or a highly consolidated executive, is often stretched thin. So when a government maybe ignores court rulings, or when powerful tools like Palantir or Endural are potentially aimed at individuals, these seemingly small acts of resistance become critical. Think about updating that sabotage manual for today, deliberately making digital submissions cumbersome, maybe engaging chatbots in circular arguments just to force human intervention, or being creative yet forgetful with passwords for government sites.
The glitch rebellion of online systems. And, considering the prevalence of what David Graeber famously called bullshit jobs, these tasks many employees feel are pointless. These acts of sabotage are kind of, they're both insignificant individually, often fitting right into existing inefficiencies, but potentially overwhelming collectively. They create that cumulative friction and systemic drag, a constant intangible drag on operations, wasting time, wasting manpower. And don't underestimate the psychological impact, fostering that gnawing sense that their control is not absolute, eroding morale. It shifts the mindset. Ordinary life becomes a kind of battlefield where every moment, every bit of friction you create is maybe a moment closer to freedom.
Thoreau, perhaps in Walden, might have seen this as a form of deliberate living, resisting that undue external control by simply refusing to cooperate smoothly with unjust systems.
I understand the argument, the appeal of direct action as a response to perceived overreach, and the ingenuity in modernizing simple sabotage is, it's certainly there. However, while individual acts might seem small, their cumulative impact, as you yourself suggest, implies either coordination or really pervasive adoption. You're essentially advocating for a type of social engineering, just from the bottom up.
Well, perhaps.
My concern remains that while disrupting things like bullshit jobs might feel empowering in the moment, widespread, often hidden acts of interpretive disobedience, acts designed to intentionally disrupt and confuse, could lead to a broader societal breakdown, a breakdown in predictability, in trust. Our sources warn that over-reliance on precedent can perpetuate erroneous interpretations, and that methodological pluralism, everyone interpreting things their own way, can lead to perceived inconsistency and unpredictability. This in turn fuels accusations of judicial activism or politically motivated decision-making.
But isn't that already happening?
Perhaps, but if citizens themselves engage in widespread sabotage, aren't we just amplifying that inconsistency and unpredictability? The source material is quite explicit. Governmental policy efficiency is positively correlated with broader institutional quality. That includes things like government integrity, regulatory quality, low corruption, property rights, contract enforcement, democratic principles, political stability, a strong rule of law. These are crucial. Deliberately injecting chaos, even with the goal of resistance, could weaken these very elements. It could lead to a system that's not just less efficient, but actually less just and less stable for all citizens, including the ones trying to resist. Remember the cost of control idea from the firing line debate? Withholding something desired, like efficiency or predictability, can itself be a form of manipulation.
The resistance has to be careful not to fall into that trap, careful not to create what Wiener called an inhuman use of human beings by focusing solely on the know-how of disruption without a solid know-what.
I acknowledge your point about the potential for unintended consequences, and the risk to institutional stability is real. It's a serious concern. Yet the whole premise of interpretive disobedience, as I see it, is precisely to resist a pre-existing effort to engineer reality from the state. That Trump takeover framework, especially Project 2025, it's described in the source material as a detailed step-by-step schematic for engineering a very specific version of reality. And even a cybernetic move to control the feedback loops of the state itself. Cybernetic meaning controlling the information flow, the responses within government.
Right, controlling the system's inputs and outputs.
Exactly. So when the entire machinery of government might be geared towards rolling out a very specific social vision, potentially using advanced tools, it creates an environment where, as one source puts it, our reality, especially our social reality, it's not nearly as fixed as we like to think it is. In that scenario, interpretive disobedience isn't really about individuals adopting a dark triad mindset. It's more about resisting a pre-existing dark triad operating at the state level, one employing manipulation, psychological tactics, a disregard for truth. The Thoreauvian text we looked at explicitly critiques this interpretive drift that is centralized power in interpreters. It advocates for citizens to read the Constitution directly, to refuse to outsource their understanding to experts or authorities. This isn't about manipulation by the citizens. It's about trying to discern truth when official narratives might be trying to poison the well, like in the Paul Benowitz case.
Ah, yes, Benowitz.
Yeah, Paul Benowitz, the electronics expert near Kirtland Air Force Base, he saw unusual activity, became convinced of cover-ups, and then intelligence agencies fed him disinformation specifically to discredit him, to make anyone asking serious questions look like a complete fool. That's a chilling example of how official narratives can be weaponized. So citizen engagement, this direct interpretive act, becomes the counterforce. It's a fight for the know-what, for the underlying principles, when those in power are leveraging their know-how to dictate reality. It's maybe about preserving what some might call K-selected traits, thoughtful long-term strategies, against an imposed R-selected cognitive chaos, which favors rapid, often less considered responses.
I certainly hear your concerns about state-sponsored reality engineering, and the Benowitz case is a truly stark illustration of the dangers of official disinformation. However, we still come back to this paradox. Using dark triad methods, even defensively, risks creating the very thing you oppose. The source material notes that the deep state's use of manipulation, narcissism, psychopathy, a lack of empathy, self-interest above all, disregard for truth, willingness to exploit, has already caused a profound erosion of public trust. It's already created this fractured hall of mirrors.
True.
So, if the resistance, however defined, adopts similar tactics, doesn't it just perpetuate this cycle of distrust, making it fundamentally impossible for citizens to discern truth, regardless of who is in the Oval Office? This speaks directly to that unsettling idea of a dark hope, or a true dark enlightenment, that concept sometimes linked to Nick Land, proposing this radical acceleration beyond traditional values. My concern isn't tied to specific political figures,
but whether the methods themselves, even if used with the intention of preventing tyranny, inherently lead to a different, maybe more insidious form of control. Weiner's point about know what over know how remains absolutely critical. A dark triad wordsmith, someone skilled in manipulation, even if they believe they're fighting for good, might become so focused on the how, deploying these sophisticated psychological and cybernetic tools that they lose sight of a truly enlightened know what. And the result? A society where people are subtly oppressed, denied genuine non-contingent freedom. A society where, perhaps, the human race will give no further trouble because it's been fundamentally reprogrammed. We only need to look at the history of programs like MKUltra, the CIA's unethical attempts to re-engineer human consciousness, to literally rewrite a person's past, to see the profound danger here, regardless of who holds the tools. It risks creating a system that crushes that complex K-selected human capacity in favor of easily managed, perhaps R-selected behaviors, no matter which side claims victory.
It really forces us to ask, what does this say about human nature, about the path we're on, if fighting for freedom seems to require becoming the very thing we oppose?
Well, both perspectives today have certainly illuminated the profound challenges we face regarding constitutional governance and citizen agency, especially in this increasingly complex, technologically mediated world. We've explored how interpretive disobedience emerges as a potential response to what some see as constitutional drift and these efforts to engineer reality.
Right, offering pathways for resistance through things like bureaucratic warfare and modernized simple sabotage. But at the same time, we've really had to consider the crucial ethical implications, questioning whether these tactics might inadvertently replicate the very patterns of control and distrust they aim to overcome.
Yeah, and potentially destabilizing the very institutional quality needed for a healthy republic. This ongoing tension between a government of laws and what might become a government of interpreters, between the Constitution's intended inefficiencies and the risk of unintended functional chaos, it remains a central challenge.